before I forget. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our Political Econ UK webinar. Today we have Anja Neundorf from the University of Glasgow, who is going to present her paper called Political Habit Formation under Democratic and Authoritarian Election. This is joint work with Ksenia Northmore-Ball, who's also present today. Before I hand over to Anja, let me just remind you that these webinars take place every 2 weeks on Mondays at 3 p.m. UK time. In 2 weeks, we are going to have Tim Besley from LSE, and that is going to be our last seminar before a summer break. As usual, you can find more information about the seminar on our website, and also you can follow us on Twitter also to have updates on what's going to happen in the fall. Let me remind you of the format before we proceed. We are going to have a 50-minute presentation with time for clarifying interim questions. Then we're going to have a 10-minute Q&A. We request all attendees to keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off, but you can ask questions via chat, and we actually encourage asking questions there. Ksenia, so the co-author of Anja, is going to be monitoring the chat, and she's going to try and answer some easy clarifying question there, or we are going to be addressing the questions during the talk or later on. Perfect. Thank you, Anja. So you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for including me in the program. I'm really excited to present this paper. It's a bit different than the last couple. This is an empirical paper, and the topic is about democratic and authoritarian elections, focusing in particular how these elections affect the voting behavior of voters. And as Ariana already said, Ksenia is here as well, so she will help me with the chat. So all the difficult questions, please, in the chat. So let me see whether this works. So let me just first motivate this topic a bit. When we think about authoritarian elections over time, when we think about dictatorships in general, we don't really think about elections, right? Elections is democracy. And this has certainly been the case for a very long time. And here we have Franco, for example, saying, you know, when he took power, we do not believe in government through the voting booth. Yeah, that was a clear distinction from democracies. Fast forward 80 years to today, and here we have, you know, Mr. Putin, and the goal for Putin's election in 2018 was to get 17% for his party at 70% turnout. So clearly, autocracies value elections much more. If we look at this with some data, when you look at this graph here, what we plot is for every 10-year period, how many elections happened in either autocracies or democracies. So here you see the interwar period that some elections in democracies were stalled. But what you see is this incredible rise of elections that happen in dictatorship. And by the 1990s, we have more or less the same number of elections, around like 3 to 4, that happen in every 10-year period, okay? And so this is what motivated our research, that we see this rise of elections and dictatorship happening, but we still don't fully understand why is this happening, why do dictatorships do this, and we understand even less how these elections affect voters, especially also in the long run, because we know that in the world today, most people either live in an autocracy or have lived in an autocracy. And so how have these elections really shaped voting behavior in the long run? So our research questions then more specifically are, does the opportunity to vote in these elections for voters lead to kind of a habit and affecting the propensity to vote in later life, even if these autocracies at some point democratize? Would we see that there's kind of long-term impacts of this experience of having voted in an autocratic election? And then the second question for us is whether it actually matters that these elections are of certain quality and are meaningful rather than they just happen. Yeah, so that is the kind of two main questions for us. And just to kind of give you, quick preview of what we're doing here and of our results. So in case you already, you want to decide whether to stick around or not. So we have two empirical approaches here. We first do a large and global analysis with over 100 countries, and including everyone born from 1900 to today. And then we have a more kind of in-depth study where we are using a better identification strategy to really identify whether what we're seeing here is causal or not. What we're finding is that indeed participating in elections, so just the act of voting, has long-term effects and has a positive effect on later life turnout. But this positive effect, which it has been demonstrated for democracy, is only really positive, this experience of voting in elections, when the elections are meaningful. What we also find is that if elections are not meaningful, and the way we conceptualize this is that it's not very competitive, it's rigged, and so on, I will go a bit more into detail about this later, and that's usually the case in autocracies, then it can actually have a negative effect. So it can suppress later turnout if voters experience these kind of non-competitive elections. Okay. We think we make several contributions with this paper. Firstly, we're speaking to two scholarly debates about political behavior and authoritarian elections that usually are really disconnected from each other. And what we're trying to do here is present a unifying framework of the study of elections and their impact of voters. So there's a lot of research on elections and democracies. But to really see elections just as an event that happens, and whether this is in democracies or autocracies, maybe this distinction is sometimes a bit arbitrary. And we're presenting here a more unifying framework to look at elections more generally. And then also our methodological approach to study this long-term impact of elections I think is quite unique to this literature. Okay, so that's a bit the setup, the motivation, what we're trying to do here. Let me now, just go a bit into detail of what we're expecting here in terms of the theory. So, as I already said, there's not much about elections that happen in dictatorships. They often are researched more from the question about the purpose, and the purpose that why dictators use these tools is they want to co-opt the elites and other powerful social groups. They use elections as a way of distributing patronage. But also more recently, it has been shown that these elections can be really helpful for gathering information about what citizens actually think, where there are pockets of potential opposition. The focus is very much about how these elections help the regimes to survive, or whether it eventually leads to democratization. The focus on voters is very limited. There's some research that looks at kind of clientelism that of course relates to voters, but apart from this, we're not aware that people have tried to actually look at how these elections impact citizens more directly. And this is of course what we are trying to do here. Why is this important? When we think about citizens and voters in the political context, there's this really nice quote by Napoleon that I like to use to really illustrate this point. And the idea here is, to understand the man, you have to know what was happening in the world when he was 20. And this is something that, kind of, goes back to, Napoleon, but has been more, kind of clearly formalized in the literature, which relates to political socialization, learning, and particular relating to the kind of turnout habit formation that we're looking at. And the idea here is that, as Napoleon expressed, political attitudes that are central to citizenship, and turnout certainly is a really important part of the political system. If no one turns out, our political system is much more volatile, much more prone to more radical choices. And these kind of behaviors and attitudes form relatively early in life. And what we also have seen empirically is that it doesn't change much in later life. So once we have formed certain identities and habits, they're quite stable. And there's some empirical research that really had tried to pinpoint when is this time. And the time of adolescence, so kind of early adulthood, is really, really important here. And it is kind of in this literature what is believed is that there are certain external factors that influence this process in forming citizens in that way. So in our paper then, what we're interested in, taking that as a kind of starting point, that it really is important what we experience when we're young to form us in terms of who we become as a political citizen. And the idea here is that competitive elections are really important, especially when it comes to voting habits and turnout. And there's two elements to this theory. The first is we need to have the opportunity to vote. Yeah, when we are young, we need to actually be exposed to elections, the whole circus of it, right? We have the campaigns, we have the debates, maybe we have to go and register on the day of the election. You have to go somewhere, to find your election booth and make a choice and so on. And if you don't have the opportunity, if there are no elections, this circus is not there, so you won't learn it. That is a first kind of basic assumption. We need the opportunity to vote in the first place. That is always assumed in democracies, right? Because as a definition, democracies hold elections. But something that is not really assumed is the question, and that hasn't really been looked at, is how meaningful does your vote actually have to be? And when we talk about meaningfulness, we're thinking about what is it that motivates voters to actually participate in the election? Yeah, from a voter's perspective, what increases the kind of benefit of voting and reducing the costs? And the idea here is that if the election actually matters and the voter understands that there could potentially be a turnover in power, maybe the voter casting the decisive vote, then the motivation is much higher. The same is, when we think about the procedure. Yeah, so it's about the fairness and the offer in terms of competition that can lead to a turnover in power. That's one dimension of that makes it an election meaningful, and the other dimension is that the process is clean. So if I go and vote, I know that my vote actually counts, and that not, when I leave, they will just stuff ballots in the ballot box, and my vote doesn't actually really matter, whatever I said, right? So there's these two different dimensions which matter for voters, whether their vote will count. And what we're assuming here is that opportunity alone, is not enough. We expect that opportunity is the kind of basic sufficient condition, but it needs to be a meaningful election and a meaningful choice for voters to take up the opportunity to vote in the first place, which then we believe leads to a habit formation that people just internalize, that participating in an election becomes just a norm for them. Yeah, that is the idea here of the theory, that it really needs both. So how does this then translate to authoritarian elections? Yeah, so we in democracies, we usually assume there's opportunities, and these elections are meaningful, they're competitive, and they're clean. Yeah, so any research that has been done on this question always looks at democracies, but it doesn't actually take into account the full range of how elections can be held and are held in the world. So how does this translate to autocracies? And the interesting bit is that authoritarian regimes use elections in very, very different ways. So there are autocracies that do not hold elections, so there is no opportunity in the first place. And then some use elections more regularly. Yeah. Of course, for us, that means we can actually look at the distinction, like, having the opportunity to vote, yes or no, is that enough? Because we can look at regimes that do not hold elections. Secondly, when it comes to meaningfulness, so this concept that we kind of relate to competitiveness and the cleanness of the election, we're looking at, huge range in terms of there's just one pre-selected candidate and there's no choice actually. That was very common in countries like Mexico and so on, where it was just one candidate on the ballot and that was it. But they held an election. And there are actually some autocracies that do hold relatively competitive election, and that can sometimes lead to some trouble. Yeah? If they underestimate how strong the opposition is, there could be kind of a tipping point when they lose grip on power. So that kind of helps us then to answer this question about, does the opportunity need to be meaningful? So just to kind of summarize this, so we have two hypotheses here that we're interested in testing. The first one relates to election opportunity. The question here is, the propensity to vote in later life is positively increases with the number of electoral opportunities experienced in the formative years. And the idea here is that there's a kind of reinforcement effect. So if we experience several elections in this crucial time when we form as citizens, that reinforces this habit, this norm of participating. And then secondly, we argue that fair and competitive elections positively reinforce this effect of electoral opportunities on the propensity to vote. So it needs both fairness and competitive having the opportunity. It's not enough just to have the opportunity, okay? Should I maybe just pause here for a second to see whether there's any fundamental in terms of the theory that you want me to go over again before I go to the empirical part of the paper? Sorry, I didn't actually check the chat. So if Ariana or Max think that there's any comments that maybe would be helpful to pick up now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I think there was like a discussion that Ksenia addressed that is going to be that we're going to discuss maybe a little bit more in the Q&A. And I guess in general, there's a couple of questions about exactly how do you proxy for elections being meaningful? Is this something that has to do with the perception of the nature of the election or the nature of the election itself? Something that has to do actually exactly as you were saying with the process and not just the fact that you can vote, but it's like, how is the vote counted? That was Kyriel's comment. And kind of finally, just a question on whether elections in democracies are always meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that actually all relates also to, the kind of data we're using. Yeah. Maybe I just continue then. So to, kind of first go over the data, what we've done here is we harmonized all the individual level data that we kind of could get out. Maybe it's not all, but it's a lot of them. We looked at, individual level survey data that ask about turnout. And so we have data that ranges, from, you see, like the first data was kind of collected actually in the 70s, and then the last data is from like the 2015. This allows us to have information from over 100 countries and around 750,000 respondents. And what we do here is we look at people that were born from 1900s onwards. So we take as our kind of crucial year or time when people get socialized into elections, starting from 20 to 29. So that time when people experience their first elections. So that setup means we have elections from around the world from 1920 onwards until today. Yeah. So it's a massive kind of large global analysis. Just to give you a bit of a feel for our outcome variable. So this is our turnout variable, just as kind of country averages across all the time points that they were collected in our data. And looking at this, so all the yellow bits are where we don't have data. So China, for example, doesn't hold national elections. Saudi Arabia doesn't hold national elections. So there's some countries where we wouldn't have data. It's still There's very few countries that do not have elections nowadays. But apart from these, most countries around the world nowadays do hold elections. And you see that there's no clear pattern. So we have some advanced democracies that have very high turnout, like Canada or Australia. New Zealand actually has compulsory voting. And India is a kind of established democracy, but there's also democracies that have lower scores, like from the UK, the US, and so on. And then there's some autocracies that you have here Iraq as a kind of transitioning country and so on. You have here the Southeast Asian countries that also are either still autocratic or really new democracies that have very high turnout. But there's a lot of variation. So there's no clear pattern. Democracies always have more turnout or not. In terms of our election variables, to also answer some of your questions, we use a data set by varieties of democracy. I'm not sure, how many are aware of this data. It is becoming probably the gold standard in political science, at least when it comes to measuring anything related to politics. And it's a data set that measures loads and loads of indicators using mainly expert surveys and on a kind of country year basis. And then they already use these kind of smaller indices or indicators to create larger indices, such as measuring what is actually democracy or and so on. So that's the data. I'm happy to talk more about kind of how the data is collected and answer criticism if you have about VDEM. I'm a big fan of that data set. It's so rich. It's really incredible. So first, let me introduce our variable that measures electoral opportunities. What we've done here is we have a count variable of each national election, whether this is in legislative or presidential. Some countries have only one, or well, I guess all countries have legislative, not every country has presidential elections. And so for every 10-year period, we count how many elections happen in each country from 1920 to kind of the last one would be 2005, because our survey data finishes in 2015. So just to look at this pattern here, we have here the US, for example, right? The US is a very established democracy. It has very regular elections, and depending on which year you look, if you are kind of in between midterms and presidential elections and so on, you either have 7 or 8 elections, right? Then we also plot here the number of elections that happen in 2 autocracies or countries that experience autocracies. So we have Chile here, which had a period of no elections during Pinochet's rule, which is similar to what happened in Franco's Spain. Yeah, so there were no elections for quite some time here in Spain in the 40s until kind of the late 50s, and then he started to introduce some. That was the kind of democratization period, and then of course the election cycle stabilized a bit. Yeah, so that's what we're leveraging here, right? So we have people that grew up, that have these important formative years when they either get kind of socialized into developing a norm or habit of election participation or not, during times when there were no elections, so they didn't have an opportunity to learn this, while other people, grew up maybe in the more later years in Spain, where they did have that opportunity. And there's quite a lot of within country variation, and of course also between country variation. Turning then to our other two, to our meaningfulness, for which we use 2 indicators. So we kind of conceptualize meaningful election along 2 sub-dimensions. So we are interested in whether an election was multi-party, so were opposition candidates allowed to run? And then secondly, we look at the process. So was there election like rigging? Was there kind of vote buying? So that's an index that VDEM created, which takes these kind of processes into account. These are all not about the perception of the voter. So I saw that somebody asked, is this about perception? But it's more, so these are expert codings mainly, but it's more like what's happening, right? So there's like, are, you know, several like candidates on the ballot, right? We can see that, like, you know, if you look at, again, like the Mexican elections in the 70s, there's like literally just one name on the ballot. That's, you know, that would be scored really low on the item multi-party elections. Then, you know, there is evidence about, you know, is the election rigging, how much vote buying is there, how much suppression is there of specific groups and so on. That would go into this item. Something that is for us quite interesting, looking at these graphs, is that when it comes to democracies, there's not much variation. It is kind of per definition, democracies have multi-party elections, more or less per definition. So here you see like a level of democracy that is an index that VDEM is using, and then we plot our value for, you know, our election variables. But you see that democracies usually score quite high on these things. But what is really interesting is that there's huge variation in autocracies. So there are autocracies that really do run multi-party elections, and they allow for competition. And there are some autocracies that do run things quite smoothly and clean. Yeah, so there is a kind of pretense and, you know, this borderline, like, do they really allow for a kind of, you know, equal playing field to allow some you know, of the opposition to actually kind of get at, to get seats, to gain some power in the legislative, which then is, you know, there's a whole power structure about how they co-opt the opposition and so on. But what we do see is that for some people that experience these autocratic elections, they experience more or less elections how we would maybe describe them and see them in democracies. Yeah. And that is what our paper allows to look at. So not only looking at democracies, we miss that there is a lot of variation on these things. Yeah, and kind of using all elections that are out there, we can really look at the entire spectrum of how these elections are held. Okay. So moving on, because sometimes people are a bit confused. It's like, what do you mean? Like, you know, like how can autocracies hold, like, you know, competitive and clean elections? And we picked 3 examples here that represent slightly different types of dictatorships and why they held elections. So for example, here we have Greece, which again, we have our democracy level, yeah? And you see that until the 70s, Greece was not a democracy. But in the interwar period, so before the military junta, and I will get back to Greece later, there were already quite competitive elections held in Greece. So institutionally, there was a lot still missing, also civil liberties and so on, that made it a democracy. But in the interwar period, a lot of the European countries were already playing and were kind of already holding quite competitive elections. Yeah, so we have these cases of countries that are autocratic still, but hold elections that are quite meaningful. And then you have here 2 examples with Malaysia and Zimbabwe, which were former British colonies, what we see there is that with independence, so we have independence in Zimbabwe, for example, happening in 1980, they keep the tradition that the British have introduced by holding multi-party elections. But we do see, for example, that these elections are now pretty rigged. Yeah, so the process really plummets. But they keep that tradition of holding multi-party election, even so Zimbabwe has never really been a democracy in the whole time period here. Yeah, so just to give you a bit of a sense, kind of who are these, which are these countries that kind of score quite high here or here, even so they're autocratic. Yeah, I hope that helps a bit with clarifying what we mean with meaningful elections. Yeah. But I'm happy to pick this up again. Obviously, that's quite important for us. Okay, so I will first present some global kind of statistical analysis based on this observational data. We just run logistic regression here. And what we're mainly interested in is, so we want to look at this direct effect of having experienced elections during the formative years. I already mentioned we know from everyone when they were born in our data set, so we know exactly when was somebody in their formative years between 20 and 29, which would be the time period that people experienced their first elections. Yeah. So we ascribe the information about the number of elections that happened in that time period for that person, and also what was the average nature of these elections that people experienced, how meaningful were they. That is our EN here, okay? And then we are very interested, of course, also in this interaction, so beta 3, which captures whether the effect of being exposed to election is conditional on the meaningfulness of that election, okay? We control for some individual level controls here. We don't have too many because we have put a lot of data together, so we're a bit limited of what we can put in here. So we have gender, education, and whether somebody's working, and then very important also age. But we only include people that are 30 or older, so they have passed the formative years. Yeah. And then we have also control variables at the time of the survey. So you might be 50 today, and we ask you about, did you vote in the last election? And we want to look at kind of how much did it influence you, what you experienced when you were younger. But of course, your turnout today will also be impacted by other things that are happening today that we know. Yeah, like we look at closeness of the last election, whether you're a democracy right now, and then also GDP and population density. Okay, so just to look at our data descriptively first, here we plot for every country cohort, yeah, what is the average turnout level depending on kind of what people experienced. Yeah, so like this is here our opportunity, election opportunity variable, and here we have our 2-dimension of meaningfulness, so competition and the process. And you see that again, kind of the dark dots are people living in a democracy at the time when they grew up, and the gray crosses are they lived in an autocracy at the time. And you see that there's, kind of just looking at the Pearson's R here, there's some difference in this. It also kind of shows that there is quite a bit of spread across these variables. So we do really use the whole spectrum here. Obviously, especially when it comes to multi-party elections, I already showed you that variable would be truncated for democracies because it's part of the definition of what makes a democracy. Yeah. So no country that doesn't have a certain level of multi-party competition can be classified as a democracy. So looking at the regression results here, this is first just the direct effects. We do find a positive impact. So with every additional election that you experience during your formative years, your propensity to turn out later in life increases. So we do find this kind of positive effect, the reinforcement effect. Once we include the direct effects for our meaningfulness variables here, competition and the process, they also have strong positive effects, yeah, direct effects, and we do actually see that the election opportunity effect gets significantly smaller. Yeah, so that already is a sign that there's probably something going on in terms of heterogeneity. There's a kind of conditional effect happening here, which is what we then looked at next. Yeah. And this is a really important finding for us, because what we're showing here is that these are the marginal effects for our election count variable when you were young. Yeah, so that's the coefficient of the opportunity, depending, conditional on what was the competition of this election. Was it a competitive election or not? And how was the process? And what we see is that these positive effects that have been actually demonstrated in democracies, they really only hold if an election is meaningful in the sense of competitive or in the process. especially when elections are not competitive. So these kind of fake elections where people are made to go to the election booth, and there's often kind of quite strong force as well by these autocracies if they do hold elections, but it's absolutely meaningless because you just need to make a cross at that one candidate, but you know that that's not really a choice. That can actually have long-term negative effects. So that can create jaded voters that in the long run, even if this country is now a democracy, do not feel that elections are important, to feel motivated to go and participate in it. Yeah. So this kind of strong negative effect here of participating in these non-competitive elections is something that hasn't been demonstrated in this sense. This is kind of just confirming the research on democracies, but this hasn't. Yeah, and that's quite fascinating to think about kind of these long-term negative impacts that this can have. We also kind of try to see whether our effects might be different, whether a country was democratic or autocratic at the time. Because it could be that this effect here, these positive effects that we do find, they are driven by these really strong established democracies, right? Because they would be always having quite competitive and fair elections, but that's not the case. So even autocracies, so we do find no conditional effect of these variables in democracies. They are truncated, so the scale is slightly different, yeah. But when you look at autocratic elections that do use the entire range, we do find that they can lead to this positive effect and or to the negative effect that we found. Yeah, so this effect of like elections do have positive mobilizing effects is not just driven by democracies. This is also happening in autocracies if they use competitive and fair elections. Yeah. Okay, that concludes the kind of global large N analysis. So I will now take kind of the last 10 minutes or so to go through an alternative identification strategy. Obviously, this is all observational data with all its problems, as we all know. So what we try to think about is like, how can we identify this better? Yeah, okay, I'll let you answer this, Ksenia. We're using here women's suffrage as a way to identify whether somebody had the opportunity to vote or not, and whether these elections were meaningful. So we use a kind of adapted difference and difference logic to test this. And what is really important for us here is to have a control group. Yeah. And so the advantage of this approach is that we can really do a within cohort comparison, because if we just look at, okay, somebody was allowed to vote in an election versus some people weren't, then we never really know whether this is because for example, if somebody some women were allowed to vote later on, and we compare that to the women that weren't allowed to vote, there will always be the problem that the women that were not allowed to vote, they will always be older. And we know that, for example, when it comes to turnout, there's a really strong age effect, that older people usually vote more than younger people, and then we have a slight kind of turn that the really old people, they start to turn again. So if we really want to know whether somebody weren't allowed to vote or not in an election had an impact, we need to distinguish also whether, how old are these people. And so if we just use, women, whether they were allowed to vote before and after suffrage would not really help. We need that control group, which in our case will be men, to do a within cohort comparison where we compare men and women of the same age. And in some cases, women were allowed to vote and in others not. Yeah, this also allows us, and I will show you some of this to test whether there's parallel age and period assumptions. These age period cohort models are a bit complicated. I'm not going to too much into detail now about the logic of this, but I'm happy to pick this up in the Q&A. I mean, most of you are economists, I guess. So, I mean, this is like a relatively standard, difference and difference logic in a way, where we have a pre-treatment, post-treatment group, and those that are eligible or not eligible. And what we do in our case, and we just take the difference of the two groups, right? What we do in our case is we look at women as our eligible group, so we're interested mostly in that. And then our treatment is whether somebody had suffrage or not during the formative years, right? So I kept stressing that there's a lot of research showing that it's really important whether we're allowed to vote when we're young, when we form these norms and behavior. And so we're looking at suffrage as during your formative years as the treatment. And what is important here is to compare this to men. Yeah, so this logic that if we just compare these two groups, we always conflate the treatment of being allowed to vote also with different levels of age. Yeah, because the pre-suffrage women will always be older. So what we're doing is we're bringing the men in here to do this within cohort comparison where they will be the same age and they will be the same age, and that allows us to look at different trends over time. So this is not a kind of traditional difference because we have our we don't have individuals like panel data, but we have cohorts. Yeah, so we look at cohorts over time in how they vote as kind of our level of analysis. Yeah. So we're interested in two types of treatments, which is suffrage during the formative years. And there's treatment A, which means you have the opportunity to vote during the formative years, or it could be treatment B, which is a bit more restrictive, which means the opportunity you had to vote was also meaningful. Yeah, because our theory is about this, right? Our theory is it's not just opportunity that matters. It matters that that opportunity is meaningful. So something to really bear in mind here, of course, is that all our survey observations are post-treatment. So this is information that was collected now. We're just taking when somebody was socialized, which was earlier or later, as the key kind of unit of analysis here. Why are men a good control group here? They have the same kind of socio-political context during their formative years. So they would be kind of the same cohort, they would be exposed to the same events, social conditions, and so on. And the only difference is kind of that, maybe they were allowed to vote while women were not yet. And it also allows us to look at parallel life cycle and also period effects to really see whether it's really just the treatment, meaning being allowed to vote potentially in a meaningful election as well, that makes the difference between men and women, yeah, the treatment group and the control group here. So our expectations then ultimately, we want to close the gender gap. Yeah, so we expect that because women that did not vote, that were not allowed to vote, did not have the opportunity and therefore did not develop the habit of voting, we would expect that there's a gender gap between those being allowed and not allowed to vote. And what we're then trying to do is to see, like once we look at and we compare the generations that both had suffrage, whether that closes the gender gap. Yeah, so the gender gap in voting is mainly because men were allowed to vote, but women were not. Yeah. And so we're looking also, of course, at whether the experience of meaningful elections is more effective than to close the gender gap than just having the opportunity, but it's not really meaningful. Yeah, that's the goal of what we're doing here. For this, we take Greece as a case study because we think Greece is a really good country for this. Just a quick kind of historical background of this. So male suffrage was introduced in the mid-19th century, but by 1900, all men were allowed to vote. So all restrictions were lifted, which is quite important for us because we can assume that in all elections since 1900, all men were allowed to vote. They did have the opportunity. While women only received suffrage in 52. And then in 56, so 4 years later, the first election happened where they were allowed to vote. But these elections from 56 to the early 70s were actually not very meaningful because at that time, Greece was a military dictatorship, and elections either didn't even happen or they happened with quite a lot of restrictions. So only from the mid-70s onwards were elections free, fair, and everyone was allowed to vote, right? So just to kind of show you this graph again, so we see here only with the 74 election is when elections were really competitive and the process was free and fair. Until then, elections either didn't happen. So you see here that there were no elections in that period, or they were still quite tainted in terms of the process and were much lower still in terms of competitiveness. Yeah. So the way we do this then is we divide the Greek respondents that were born from 1900 to 1996, sorry, into 7 cohorts. Yeah. So as I said, the cohorts, the birth years is our kind of unit of analysis. So our first 2 cohorts are those that where only men were allowed to vote and women were not. There's a, in the beginning of the, this is like this interwar period where elections were a bit more competitive, but only men were allowed to vote. In the cohort 3 is when then finally those born between 1932 and 42 is when women were allowed to vote, but these elections were not yet competitive, so they were not meaningful. There was a really, kind of short period, so we only have 3 birth years here where they're kind of during their formative years between 20 and 29, no election happened. Yeah. So that's also something to bear in mind here. Just for information. And then from, as I said, cohort 5, so from those that were in their formative years from the mid-70s onwards is when there was full suffrage. So women were allowed to vote and also elections were competitive and meaningful. We included further small cohorts here for the younger, just to see whether there's a general trend happening with women just maybe voting more now. Yeah, so this is why we divided up the cohorts that came later on to look at a general trend happening. The model that we're estimating is this. So we have here our cohort dummies and our treatment variable, which is female, for those that were either allowed to vote or not. And then ultimately what we're interested in is this interaction here between our cohort variable and female. And then we also include the year dummies, and we include age dummies and 10-year age cohorts, groups. Yeah, so that controls for potential life cycle effects or potential period effects that something is happening right now that affects everyone's turnout. And here are the results. So what we see is these are basically marginal effects of women. So we compare women versus men in the same cohorts across our different cohorts here. So what we see is this is when female suffrage was included. As I explained, the first election that then happened, this first group, cohort 3, women were allowed to vote, but it wasn't yet meaningful. It was only from cohort 5 that elections were meaningful. So what we see here basically is that, taking the last cohort, the youngest as a reference, there's no gender effect anymore for the cohorts when both men and women were allowed to vote and the elections were meaningful. But it was not enough for women to be allowed to vote in uncompetitive elections. Yeah. And so this is for us evidence that given this setup where we really do a within comparison of cohorts, and using women's suffrage as a kind of identification strategy here, that confirms the findings of our global analysis that indeed having the opportunity to vote did close the gap between men and women, but only once these elections were meaningful. Yeah. Just to show you quickly the parallel trends, so it's quite important for our theory that in terms of the pre-treatment cohorts, there is no particular kind of age differential or also like over time in terms of the period. this difference is expected, right? We expect that based on our theory that women are less likely to vote. So this gap totally makes sense, but we more or less want to see that the trend is parallel. And I mean, with age, the women do seem to drop off a bit, faster than men. When it comes to the period effect, I would say descriptively that looks pretty parallel. Please feel free to challenge me on this. We did also try to replicate the models by relaxing this. So here I show you the results again that I just showed you, relaxing the age parallel trends. And we again find the same pattern. This first cohort now becomes insignificant, but there's also now kind of fewer people in this very old groups. When we relax the period parallel trends, our results look exactly the same again. Yeah. So we hope that that's convincing enough that the parallel trends are not such a huge problem or okay. So just to wrap up now, so what we think we have done in this paper is, I think we have hopefully improved our understanding of voter turnout habit formation by presenting a kind of much larger set of election contexts that people can experience when they're young, by really looking at the kind of whole range of electoral contexts that someone can be exposed to. And by including particular authoritarian elections, we were able to tease out that it's not enough just to be able to vote in an election. This election needs to be meaningful, it needs to be competitive, and the process needs to be fair. The implication of our research is basically that as elections are happening more and more in autocratic regimes, there's a clear legacy of these elections. And we need to be aware that even if these countries democratize, there might be a whole group of voters that does not feel very enthusiastic about elections. They were turned off by elections because they participated in these fake elections, and that has internalized and has created jaded voters. So we might have to put particular effort into mobilizing these voters and convincing them and relearning that elections are really important for the democratic process, because they certainly did not learn that in the elections that they did experience during these dictatorships. Okay, I think I will leave it there. Yeah, so I guess we have about 10 minutes or so for further Q&A. There's a lot of action on the chat, but
yes. So great. Thanks, Anja. This was super interesting. So we had a few questions in the chat that Ksenia asked, Ksenia answered. But in addition to this, if you want to ask a question as a participant, also feel free to raise your hand. And for that, you just go to the participant, click on participants, and then you're going to have a raise hand option.
And sorry, there are a few questions in the chat that I thought were rather bigger questions. So I think I noted that to the people asking the question. So those questions
Perfect.
I didn't answer in the chat because I thought others might be thinking about them. So please, if I'll try to find them, but if someone feels that, remembers I said that we should talk about it, then please so raise your hand.
Yeah, I think maybe if people just want to, because I'm not sure like which questions were answered and which haven't really, if maybe you just want to ask your question again, and then I can try to answer.
So while we, great.
Maybe Ksenia, if you want to kind of summarize those big questions for the discussion, and people can ponder on them and raise hands as we go.
So some of the bigger questions was, one question was about the sort of voting as communication. So, and let me see where. So, yeah, so if voters are communicating, something through their votes. And this was to Piketty's paper. Should we answer this straight away? I don't know, or should I go?
Sorry, let me just give you a context because it was actually my question. I was thinking
Okay.
aloud to myself. I mean, the idea is that, you know, sometimes elections are important, not because of the results that they produce, but because there is something going on in the background. There is some kind of game among people, you know, collectively communicating with each other. The original point was about democratic elections, when it was like a three candidates, and the issue was who is going to the, you know, who's going to be elected. But a similar argument could be made about autocratic elections. This is, you know, even if this is an autocracy and we kind of know that the system will survive in the medium term, still they are important because this is a way for people to communicate, for example, to the authorities that they care or they don't care, or there is an approval or disapproval. And maybe even within the autocratic regime, you know, some faction is going to prosper or not, depending on the result.
Do you have some thoughts? I have some thoughts too, but I'll maybe let you have a turn.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that that's for sure happening. And there's also, you know, quite an interesting literature more recently, maybe, about how autocracies use these elections for information collection. So there's, I mean, I mentioned that China, for example, doesn't hold national elections, but they do hold local elections. And what they do is they, I mean, they're often not competitive. So you have like your Communist Party, you know, kind of candidates just being on the ballot. But it is possible to also get on the ballot as an independent candidate. And what the Central Committee does is they look at these results very carefully to determine which kind of local governors and politicians or party members doing a good job or not. So you still, as a voter, could send a signal by not really turning out. So low turnout would be seen as a bad signal. Or if there is indeed an independent candidate, if that independent candidate gets quite a few votes, they would never win. They don't have a chance to win. But that could mean that the Central Committee would get rid of that candidate. And that had actually, there's some research also showing that this, you know, information collection mechanism and this kind of accountability mechanism, even in these elections, has increased the kind of work of these local officials, because they have an incentive now to get elected, at least in the pretense. So I agree that this is really important. But again, a lot of this research focuses on the regime. It focuses on the institutions, on the political actors, and it is not very much focused on what does that actually mean for the voters? Why would the voters be motivated to be part of that play? Yeah, and I think this is what we're trying to do here by kind of going beyond the typical institution and actors perspective of these elections and focusing rather also on voters.
Thank you.
Can I add just one little thing there? Like, so Anja pretty much covered it, but with the research on China, there's a bit of evidence that shows that even having sort of two candidates that are sort of selected by the Communist Party increases the voters' feeling of efficacy. So even if the voters don't take different policy positions clearly, etc., just the choice motivates voters to take up the opportunity to vote and feel efficacious. So there is that little bit of evidence that shows that choice means something.
Great. So I think we still have time for another question, and coming Chan, I think, was getting ready to ask his question.
Thank you for your great presentation. Actually, I come from Hong Kong, and I study authoritarian regime voting, and I have two questions. First of all, is about the Greece case. That is the jump for the reduction in the gender gap. When I look at the result, my thinking is that is it because of the learning effect of the suffrage for female, or is it because in wave 5 the election become more competitive? You know what I mean? Because in wave 3 there's already the women in Greece could already come into the election, and there can be learning event. Yeah, and wave 5 is the supply, what I call supply side effect. That means the election became more competitive. That means there are two mechanisms at play. That's possible, right?
No,
that's my first question. And the second question is about the perception, because in the APC analysis, there's no subjective measure about the meaningful and opportunity. It's more like comment that is the CSES actually asked the question about whether the respondents think that the election is the fairness and also the importance. I think there can be some leverage in it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, maybe about the last point. I mean, I agree that it's probably quite important to also look at the perception. But what we're doing here is we're going back in time, right? So if I ask respondents now, do you think that the election that we just had, like we had an election in Poland yesterday, right? Was that free and fair, or what? Are you happy with the process, right? So it's about evaluating how the election went now, today, yeah? But what we are looking here is, what was the election like when you were young? And we have, we go back in time by including elections from 1920 onwards. And so we can only work with these more, let's say, objective measures. But I think maybe we can still look at this data. Maybe if you don't mind, write it in the chat, which data set you mean, because we of course have the information about
CSES.
Okay. We have information about our measures now, and we can compare it whether these measures are in line with what voters perceive, and then just infer that if they work today, hopefully it also more or less captures how the elections were back then. To your second point, if you look at this graph, what we do here is, remember, we compare within generations. Yeah, so this coefficient compares men and women that both were only allowed to vote in the 70s. Yeah, and so these women, they did not experience these elections. So I agree. What happens is that these women here that were in this group, that were among the first to actually be allowed to vote, their turnout will go up with time. That's a normal life cycle effect. Yeah, so we do learn with time, but it's really crucial where our starting point is. Yeah, so when we think about cohorts, that's different starting levels, and then we grow, in turnout. So that's documented. But the question is, where's the starting level? And what we see is that this group here of women, they still remain below men, while when we kind of move to the time when elections were more meaningful, men and women were just as likely to vote.
Okay, that means that's the within cohort debate.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
So within cohort comparison, where we compare our treatment group, the women, to the control group, the men. Yeah.
Great. So thanks everyone. We are almost out of time, so we're going to conclude the official presentation here, and we're going to see you in 2 weeks with Team Besley, but we're going to keep the meeting open, so if you have additional questions, just feel free to stick around, and we can have you can ask it to Anja and Ksenia. Great, but thank you everyone for joining us for today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. I can't wait to read everything.
Yes, no, and of course we're saving the chat and we're going to be sending it to you, so it's all saved somewhere.